best football weekend of the year is here. Of course, we're talking divisional playoff preview, and we're going to walk you through all the best plays for this week's fantasy game day action. Tom, before we dive in, the game day guides have set us up beautifully. We've got 4 ballers contests, 1 for each of the matchups, and then, of course, the main slate, all 4 games, no captain pick this week, but it has got the extra flex. Does that change how you're approaching it this week as we set things up?
I can understand the argument for it that, you're going to look at a small slate, and a captain pick on a small slate can change things incredibly dramatically. Personally, I kind of wish they'd kept things the same. I wish that the budget was the same as it's been for most of the year. I'm not a big fan of games changing the format. But if you're looking at the extra flex, I think that's where it's going to be won this week rather than the captain spot. I think it will be. Do we get a guy like Jahan Dotson, Demarcus Robinson popping up for a touchdown and making the difference and hitting on those guys and working out which of those guys is the more favorable matchup is probably going to be key.
Yeah, absolutely. It just adds a different level of thought process analysis. Same with you. I quite like the captain pick. I kind of get the process behind it, but to me, it's really fun trying to go, am I going to go chalk? Am I going to try and be a bit different and working out how to approach it? But we're going to dive straight in to the matchups. We're going to walk you through every single game. But before we do that, if you haven't checked out Fantasy Game Day, use that code TFS23 for a free second entry when you deposit and when you click play. Tom, we're going to start. We'll do it in chronological order. So Texans at Chiefs. Of course, the Texans, they get the Saturday non-prime time slot. We'll start on the Texans side of things. I kind of pointed out that they were quite interesting in terms of value, and it turned out being one of the key plays last week. Do you think it could be history repeating itself and the Texans could find their way into some decent lineups this week?
I'm not too sure, to be honest, because the Chiefs have really gotten better and better over the last few weeks, and we'll get to them in a bit. But it's like you look at what the Texans are facing, one of the better defensive lines in the league. We know they're going to bring pressure, and CJ Stroud has been woeful under pressure this year. He ranks 24th in completion percentage since week 11, taking the 7th most sacks. The one thing that's kind of positive for fantasy, though, is when he is pressured, he tends to look deep. He's got the 6th highest average depth of target against pressure. The Chiefs, they've allowed the 5th most completions of 20-plus yards since week 11. I do just worry, though, that, we were looking at this Chiefs defense a few weeks back and saying, well, the cornerback play is poor. You should be targeting them. But since Jalen Watson returned in week 14, they've been one of the best defenses in the league, and they played a tough stretch there. The Chiefs, they play the second most high coverage. That's not a look which CJ Stroud's been good against as well this year. So all the things that I look at on CJ Stroud's side, I find it difficult to see him as a good value, because even against the Chargers, he only completed 66% of his passes, didn't reach 300 passing yards. He only threw for a single touchdown. He hasn't thrown for 3 or more touchdowns in a game since week 6. CJ Stroud just isn't a good fantasy quarterback in the way that we need him to be, particularly on a small slate where you're competing with Lamar, Josh Allen, Jane Daniels. Now, the fact that he ran a little bit last week was encouraging, and maybe he can get up there, but I don't see it. I think it's more viable on the single game ballers slate that I'd be interested in taking him if he was in play there. You look outside of CJ Stroud, obviously Nico Collins is a great play every single week. When these teams met in week 16, he was held to only 7 catches for 60 yards, no targets inside the red zone. But I find it hard to fade somebody with Nico Collins upside. It's easier for me to fade Joe Mixon because the Chiefs, they've only allowed 2 players to go over 70 rushing yards against them all season. Joe Mixon has, he's been up and down. And when these teams met in week 16, he had 14 rush attempts for 57 yards. It feels like Joe Mixon could get scripted out of this one. If you're looking for dart throws, I like John Mechie because the Chiefs allow a league high 110 receiving yards per game to slot receivers since week 10. John Mechie plays 56% of his snaps from the slot. And then Dalton Schultz, the Chiefs' biggest weakness is against tight ends. They allow 4th most points to a position. 12 different players have had 40 or more receiving yards against them, including Dalton Schultz in week 16, who had 545 and a touchdown.
Yeah, I quite like the Schultz play. I think there's another tight end on the slate that we'll come to later that I much prefer. But I think if I'm trying to build different, he's someone that I'm intrigued by. Joe Mixon struggled in practice this week. He's questionable going in. I think there's no doubt that he is going to play.
Yeah.
Does there potentially open the door for whether it be Derek Ogunbowale or Damian Pierce? They're both at the Stone Cold minimum, £2,200. We say every week there's basically no key enablers in this because all the key plays are higher priced. Could you be tempted to try one of those if you're looking to get a bit different?
Not really, to be honest, because like you look at Damian Pierce this year, and outside of that week 18 game, and he's just been miserable. Like his highest RB finish this year was RB 19 in week 6. Outside of that, he's not finished higher than RB 64. He's had one double-digit game all year, apart from week 18. I really struggle to think that when the game's on the line, that Joe Mixon isn't going to be out there.
Yeah, it does feel like unless we get some news that Mixon's going to see a limited
Yeah.
snaps or something like that, I think you're probably getting a little bit too cute trying to attack that. On the other side of the ball, though, Tom, we know that the Texans' defense play man coverage at one of the highest rates in the league. We know that Patrick Mahomes, when it gets to the playoffs, starts to scramble a little bit more. Not as good as a defense against scrambling quarterbacks playing man because you've got your back turned to the quarterback. Does this interest you in Mahomes? Are we going to see an increase in scrambling and potentially he could slot into your quarterback slot at that sort of mid price of 6,800?
Yeah, I'm much more interested in Mahomes. And to your point, the Texans have allowed 7 different quarterbacks to rush for 33 or more yards this year. Mahomes averages 29.1 rushing yards in the playoffs compared to 20.0 outside of the playoffs. And I think Mahomes, he's going to have to play well because this defensive line for the Texans is so beastly. But Mahomes, he plays mistake-free football. He's very good at that. He plays clean games. I think that we're going to see him under pressure plenty. Like, since week 11, he's seen the 5th most snaps under pressure, but I just don't think it's going to throw him enough where I think I see the Texans completely reducing his fantasy value. I would have liked to have been excited about the running game for this one. I would have hoped that by now Isaiah Pacheco would be back to a point where we can have some faith in him, but it just seems like he's completely not healthy from the broken fibula just yet. He averaged 3.1 yards per carry since week 13. His rush attempts decreased in the last 4 games, as did Kareem Hunt. They just seem to be moving to the wide receiver position. The Texans have been excellent against the run. Like, this is a team, top 2 in DVOA. They've since the start of week 13, the Chiefs running backs have combined for a single game with a double-digit performance. That was week 16 when Hunt had 1155 and 1 on the ground. So it wasn't even particularly impressive. You're talking like 11 points. Kareem Hunt's price of 4K, you can probably be okay with getting 11, 12 points, but it's not going to win you a week at all. Excuse me. I think this game is more interesting for what the Chiefs do at wide receiver, with Xavier Worthy hitting 19.6 or more points in each of his last 3 games. Marquise Brown, since his return in the 2 games he's played, seen target shares above 18%. Do we see that trend continue as those two separate from DeAndre Hopkins, or is DeAndre Hopkins going to see a greater snap count now that the Chiefs don't have to worry about the 5th round they paid the Titans becoming a 4th based on snap rates? The Texans, they are a good pass defense, but I just think that they might struggle against this multitude. I'm not as keen on Travis Kelce as some people might be. He's posted a career low 51.4 yards per game this year, along with his first year where his yards per reception's below double digits. A year ago, he went on that astronomical playoff run where he had 37 targets, 32 catches, 355 yards, and 3 touchdowns in 4 games. But Kelce just looks so slow this year. The Texans, they aren't a team that gives a lot of tight end production up. They have allowed 3 touchdowns to tight ends since week 15, but on the year, they are definitely not one of the teams we target often with tight ends.
Yeah, it feels wild looking at this slate. If you'd have told me a month ago, Isaiah Pacheco against the Texans defense, which has got elite pass rushers, elite corners, a little bit weak down the middle, Isaiah Pacheco would be £3,600. I'd be smashing it every day of the week. But here I am looking at it going, I don't think he's going to get enough volume to even get close to me considering him. I'll be honest, this is probably a matchup that I'm less likely to be looking at stacking or attacking for the kind of big games. There's nobody that I particularly love on the Chiefs side. I could paint a picture of all four of the receiving weapons kind of paying off and kind of being useful, but I don't necessarily know quite how it's going to shake out. Is Stingley going to follow Hopkins? Is Worthy or Brown going to kind of cannibalize each other? Is Kelsey going to be playoff Kelsey, or is he going to be the Kelsey that we've seen for the last 3 months? Like, I just don't know. And I think for me, I'd rather look at other options that I feel a little bit more confident in the volume and the role they're going to play.
Yeah, just one last point I forgot there. The Texans, they've given up the 6th fewest yards on 20-plus yard pass attempts since week 11, so hitting them deep isn't something that's been working out. But they've been really vulnerable against screens. They've allowed the 8th most yardage to screens and design plays. I think Xavier Worthy's completely fine. He's seen the 18th most design play targets this year, and I think I'd be most interested in him. Maybe I'd go Mahomes, Hollywood, Worthy as a stack, but probably not.
Yeah, and on that point, the Chiefs are 30th in plays of 20-plus yards all season. Yeah. So, the Chiefs have been nickel and diming people down the field. They've not relied on those explosive plays, but now we're in the playoffs. Who knows? We're going to move across to the Saturday night game, though, a little bit more juicy when we're looking at those over-unders, points scored, and all of that kind of thing. The Commanders at the Lions. We'll start with the Lions side. David Montgomery back this week, looking like and sounding like he's going to have a full workload. Does that mean Jahmyr Gibbs, 8,200? Are you looking elsewhere for that high-price running back spot this week?
I'm kind of okay with it. I think that because Montgomery's coming back, that we're going to see a lot of people feel like they can't play Jahmyr Gibbs. But let's remember that Jahmyr Gibbs has been excellent for a sustained period of time. I mean, look, David Montgomery last played in week 15. Well, Jahmyr Gibbs in week 14, 19 points. In week 15, 28 points. Jahmyr Gibbs scored 25 plus points in each of his last 4 games. He's also had 4 more receptions in each of his last 5 games. Now, I do think that's an area which the Commanders are good against. They tend to lock down pass catching running backs in that area. But I do think that you can play both here. I think Montgomery is a good salary saver if you're looking to not play Jahmyr Gibbs. But I think if I was going to fade Gibbs, it would be more about leaning into the pass. And when you look at the Commanders, they are not a good defense. They've improved from where they were last year, but they ranked 24th against the pass, 26th against the run. I really like Amon-Ra St. Brown this week because one of the big vulnerabilities for the Commanders is the short area of the game. So Jared Goff leads all quarterbacks in fantasy points versus man coverage. The Commanders play that at the 6th highest rate, but he doesn't throw deep against these looks. He's got the 6th lowest ADOT in the league because he works the intermediate area well. The Commanders, they're pretty good against like passes 10 to 19 yards deep, but they allow a league high 9.68 yards per reception to passes 1 to 9 yards deep. That just sounds like Jared Goff's area of the field where he's going to be able to dink and dunk it. I think Amon-Ra St. Brown, a guy who's had 6+ receptions, 60+ yards in his last 4 games, is an obvious play. Jameson Williams is a boom or bust play, less than 40 yards in 3 of his last 6 games, but his week winning upside is always going to be worth chasing. And he's had a target share of 19% or more in 6 of the last 7 games. Sam Laporta I like as well. The Commanders have allowed 8 different Titans to score touchdowns against him this year, and he's averaged 68 yards per game over his last 4. And again, he probably fits into that close to the line of scrimmage stuff. So I'm not too worried about the running back position. I think you can play potentially both of them in a 55-point over-under on a short slate like this. It's just where the power of the 2 of them can combine to wipe out Barkley and Derrick Henry.
Yeah, it feels like there's lots of ways you can attack this from the Lions' perspective. I guess the challenge is that they're all reasonably expensive. There's not many cheap options. Yeah. So maybe trying to squeeze multiple pieces in is going to be a challenge. On the other side of the ball, though, there are some cheaper options. We've got some intriguing value. Both the running backs priced 4,200 and below. We know that this Lions defense is one of the worst in the league at covering running backs out of the backfield. Does that mean Austin Eckler 4,200, Brian Robinson 3,800? Are they must starts for you?
Brian Robinson isn't. I mean, look, we've done our time with Brian Robinson, but it's just been pretty miserable of late. Last week, Brian Robinson had 10 attempts for 16 rushing yards. Now we know that Tampa's good against the run, but much like the Lions, they're good against the run, but weaker against pass catching running backs. So I don't see this being a Brian Robinson game. Again, if it's going to be high tempo, if it's going to be high scoring, I think this leans more to Austin Eckler, who last week, when he was cheaper, was the easier play. This week at 4,200, he's still kind of fine. But I think you're praying for a touchdown for either of those guys. Outside of them, very much into Jaden Daniels. Like, he's just been excellent. He's thrown 2 or more touchdowns in each of his last 6 meaningful games, averaged 76 rushing yards between weeks 12 and 17. The Lions leave the league in man coverage, which you already mentioned, makes it easier on the quarterback to go out there and rush. I think that we're going to see plenty of Terry McLaurin. He's having a career year with 13 touchdowns. The Lions, they've allowed 235 more yards than any other team on passes to the deep left or the deep right of the field. And Terry McLaurin led the league in fantasy points per route run on those targets. So I think you definitely want to be looking at Terry McLaurin in these games. Diami Brown caught all 5 of his targets last week, seems to be the wide receiver 2. Olamide Zacchaeus kind of went back into that wide receiver 3 range. Less interest in Zach Ertz. He's been below 26 receiving yards in 3 of his last 5 games, kept below 3 receptions of the same amount, completely touchdown or bust reliant. And the Lions, they've allowed the second fewest Titan fantasy points this year and only 3 touchdowns to Titans all year.
Yeah, I think the Zach Ertz play for me, it's against a team that plays the majority of zone coverage. I think he can win. A team that's playing him up man, I don't think he can separate. So yeah, I'd be shocked if Zach Ertz is putting up anything big this week. We're going to move across to Sunday though. A very, very intriguing offensive matchup. The Rams at the Eagles. The Eagles, the 5 horses of the apocalypse. Which way are you attacking it this one? The receivers feel cheap, but obviously you've got Saquon, 8,200, and the receivers, you're having to rely on Jalen Hurts throwing the ball.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's not sugarcoat it. AJ Brown, 6,600, but last week he's coming off a season low 3 targets, 1 catch for 10 yards. Like last week, Jahan Dotson had more receiving yards than AJ Brown. He can read all the books that he wants on the sideline. Inside, the rage is bubbling up. But yeah, I do think I'd prefer to go to Devonta Smith. This Rams defense will have the 12th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Devonta Smith's been more consistent than AJ Brown. He's been over 50 yards in each of his last 4 games, been over 100 in 2 of those. He also led the team in red zone targets this year. And I think if I'm getting Devonta Smith 800 cheaper than AJ Brown, I can definitely go that way. When these teams met in week 12, the tail of it was completely Saquon Barkley, though, who touched the ball a combined 30 times that day for 302 yards, 2 touchdowns, 46 PPR points. Barkley was averaging like nearly 10 yards per carry that night. It was just utterly absurd on every level. I do think, though, that Sean McVay is a good enough schemer that he's going to be able to try and take a bit of that away this time around. The Rams have got several players back from injury who didn't play that night. The Eagles have got players who were playing then who aren't going to play now, so it won't be a like for like necessarily. I don't mind Jalen Hurts. I think if you want to go Jalen Hurts, AJ Brown, Devonta Smith or something, or Jalen Hurts, one of the wide receivers, and Dallas Goedert, it makes sense. I mean, Jalen Hurts, when the teams met in week 12, he only passed the ball 22 times because Saquon was going crazy. That was the 3rd fewest amount the Rams faced this year. Hurts only put up 15 points, but he was scrambling well that night, and it felt like they couldn't stop his scrambling. Dallas Goedert, the Eagles, they really, like I mentioned this last week, they wanted him out there in week 18 to get back up to speed. And then last week, he was well involved. And over the last 5 games he's played, he's had 26 targets, caught 2 touchdowns. The Rams will have 6th most tight end fantasy points for position. 9 different tight ends have finished tight end 11 or better against them. So I do like Dallas Goedert in this spot. And I probably will have a Jalen Hurts, Devonta Smith, Dallas Goedert stack.
Yeah, this is more of a matchup that I'm very intrigued by. I look at the receiver prices, I look at the Hertz price, and it's enough to tempt me in. You know, if you're talking, I can get Hurts 1,200 cheaper than Josh Allen, cheaper than Jaden Daniels, and all that kind of stuff. It feels like a sensible play. I do just worry though that this Rams defense is just going to load the box and say, right, Saquon Barkley's not beating us. Jalen Hurts has got to beat us with his arm, and with how he's been playing the last few weeks, I don't know if he's good enough versus loaded boxes versus a defense that we know can get pressure rushing for. He's going to be able to consistently find guys. So yeah, it's going to be a fascinating matchup, and I think there's a lot of ways you could attack it from the Eagles side. On the other side of the ball, the Rams, we know Puka's good value. We know Stafford can potentially get there. Cooper Kupp, it feels like it's been about, 6 weeks since he last produced. The price has dropped again, Tom. £4,000. Tell me, am I absolutely crazy for thinking he's potentially the best value on this entire slate?
So over the last 6 games, Puka Nakua's had 62 targets to Cooper Kupp's 24. Kupp has had one game with more than 29 yards since the beginning of December. His first and only target against the Rams came halfway through the third quarter. You go back and look at that game, and there's people like Davis Allen with more targets than Cooper Kupp last week. He just wasn't involved in the game plan. Now, I think the big difference between this matchup and the last time these teams played, linebacker Nakobe Dean for the Eagles, who tore his patella tendon last week. Sean McVay is the kind of person who can latch on to a weakness and exploit it. So perhaps he could get Cooper Kupp going against these linebackers, the middle of the field, open it up. But I just think it's so much more likely that it's going to be a Puka Nacua week, who leads all wide receivers in reception since week 11. His 3.7 yards per route run trails only Marvin Mims in that time. Nakua's 434 yards after the catch is a league high in that period. The only downside with him, and the whole downside with the Rams offense, has just been a lack of touchdowns. Like Nacua, he's only got 3 receiving touchdowns this season. Matthew Stafford, the reason he's not been fantasy viable is the fact that he's only thrown for 2 touchdowns once in his last 4 games, put up the lowest amount of passing touchdowns in a healthy season since 2019. And the inability to just maximize those touchdowns, that's what's killed them. So, yeah, I do struggle with the idea of wanting to stack up the Rams. I think I'm more interested in Puka one-off. I do like Tyler Higbee because last week we saw it. His last catch was with 4 minutes remaining of the first quarter, but by that point, he did 5 catches for 58 yards. He was a huge part of things last week, and I think that if the game had carried on, he would have had a lot more involvement. Kyren Williams, look, I mean, against this Eagles defense, they're very good against the run. They're 4th best team in run defense DVOA. They allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points to the running back position. Williams is going to get a bunch of touches. Last week we saw it, 19 touches against the Vikings. Ronnie Rivers only had 3 touches. With Blake Corum not out there, you're not going to get much. But I just don't think it's going to be a Kyren Williams week. Since week 13, like, Williams has averaged over 18 points per game, but the Eagles, they've only allowed 1 running back to score over 17 points this year. It's a hard sell for me on Kyren.
Yeah, I think you're getting some value. He's in that kind of second tier value of running backs below Henry, Gibbs, Barkley, but there's just other guys in that value point that I think have got safe floors and potentially high ceilings. Tom, I feel like we can't talk about the Rams though without touching on Demarcus Robinson. He's at the stone cold minimum, 2,200. He's had 5 games this year over 10 points. Do you think there's a world where potentially a touchdown could make Demarcus Robinson the lone kind of enabler that we could walk into, allowing us to go and load the rest of the lineup with studs?
Well, Demarcus Robinson had those games, but Demarcus Robinson had a lot of those games when, like, one of Kupp or Nacua was injured. Like, since the 8th of December, this is Demarcus Robinson's game lines. In a game against the Bills, where there was 86 points combined, he had 1 target, 0 receptions. The next week, 1 target, 0 receptions. The next week, 1 target, 0 receptions. The week after that, in week 16 against the Cardinals, 2 targets, 0 receptions. Then he had his big week 18 game, 6 for 3 for 72. And then last week against the Vikings, 1 catch, 23 yards. So, I mean, like, Yeah, I mean, if you want similar production to Cooper Cup at an even cheaper price, then maybe Demarcus Robinson's the guy. You know that we're going to get Demarcus Robinson typically on the perimeter, and I just think that's an area where the Eagles are pretty good at defending.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. But I think there's at least a dart throw in there. Maybe it's in the Ballers lineup where you're looking for someone to get a little bit different to enable you to load up on some of those more expensive players across the way. We've hinted at it, we've teased at it. The game of the week, the game of the season, Tom. The Ravens at the Bills. I'm going to make you wait a little bit longer. Let's talk about the Bills first. Look, it feels like somebody's going to be useful. I have no idea who it's going to be on this Bills offense. So is the answer the only player you can trust, Josh Allen, right now?
Yeah, I think that's the obvious one. I mean, look, if they can get James Cook rolling, then absolutely James Cook can have value in this game, particularly at 6,600. I don't think it would be astonishing to see him have similar points to Derrick Henry or to have more points from Derrick Henry if the Bills are able to keep Derrick Henry in check. The Ravens have given up only one 25-plus yard run this year. They've been excellent against the run all year, but look, the Bills' run scheme is excellent, and James Cook has been excellent. So I don't have any problem there. Josh Allen, like you say, is just phenomenal when it comes to the playoffs. Like he's played in 11 postseason games, completed 65% of his passes for 2,995 yards, 23 touchdowns to 4 interceptions, and 609 rushing yards in those 11 games and 5 touchdowns. Like it's almost a certainty that you're getting 50 yards out of him. I do think that there's going to be value in trying to take shots at some of the wide receivers not named Khalil Shakir. Khalil Shakir has been excellent all year, second most yards after the catch among wide receivers behind only Jamar Chase. But we saw it last week with Curtis Samuel. If you choose the correct role player, then it can just blow up in a second and you can have a huge week. I think I'd be more tempted with Curtis Samuel or Ty Johnson or one of the tight ends, perhaps, than I would be Keon Coleman and Amari Cooper, because the Ravens have been very good at defending the perimeters going back pretty much all season. That's been one of their stronger points of their defense, where they were giving up plays was the middle of the field. And I think that Kyle Hamilton's going to be, his eyes are going to be on Josh Allen so much that it might allow guys like Khalil Shakir and Curtis Samuel to be able to find those little areas where they can pop off big plays.
Yeah, I think it's basically the question of who's Brandon Stevens going to be covering, isn't it? Because we know that Marlon Humphreys, we know that Nate Wiggins are both playing phenomenal football. We know that Cole Hamilton's going to be here, there, and everywhere. And it's about the Ravens' defense is a very clear weak point in Brandon Stevens. And it's, if you tell me whichever wide receiver he's going to be covering for the majority of the game, that's the person I want in my lineup. I have no idea who it's going to be, but that's the person I want in my lineup. So yeah, it could end up being Keon Coleman potentially. It could end up being Amari Cooper. Who knows? They're all very cheap. I think they're all well worth a dart throw because one of them is going to have some production. I just don't know which one.
Yeah, I agree entirely, and I wouldn't be surprised to see plenty of Tre'Davious White out there as well. The Ravens know that Brandon Stevens is a liability at this point, and just it's a shame because last year he played really well and he bet on himself. The Ravens put a contract offer in front of him reportedly this last offseason, and he said that he wanted to bet on himself this year, and he's cost himself millions of dollars.
You don't like to see it, but let's move across to the Ravens side of the ball. I know you're itching to talk about Derrick Henry. Is he an absolute must start at £8,000?
Well, I think the key to success for the Ravens, particularly without Zay Flowers, who's been listed as doubtful, it kind of has to be Derrick Henry. Last week, 26 carries for 186 yards, 2 touchdowns, 12 missed tackles forced. Obviously, when these teams met way back in, what was it, week 4, Derrick Henry had that 87 rushing yard touchdown straight off the bat on the first play of the game. And it just set the tone. That's really, for me, when Derrick Henry just kind of kicked into gear with the Ravens. Last week, we saw more stuff that we haven't seen from him this year. We saw him lined up in the wildcat position. I think he'd only taken 1 wildcat snap all season before then. And it just felt like the Ravens were completely happy to load up on the big personnel, put 6 linemen out there quite happily. They've done that a lot this year. And just lean into it. I think that Lamar was judging when to pull the ball and when to let Henry keep it really well. The Bills are second in the league in runs stuffed for a loss or no gain, but the Bills defense has also allowed the most percentage of runs that went for 10 plus yards this year. And the Ravens, they've gained 10 plus yards on 24% of their plays this year, which is first. So it's on the Bills to try and stop those massive runs. Now, obviously, their defense is healthier than it was when these teams first met, but the Ravens' defense is also better than it was when these teams first met. When it comes to the passing game, Rashad Bateman, 5 touchdowns in his last 5 games. I think that's going to be key, not in terms of volume necessarily. And at 4,200, though, I think it's still fine. Last week, he led the team in routes run when it came to wide receivers with 21. Tylan Wallace was second at 15. I think we'll see a lot from Tylan Wallace again because they love what he brings to the team as a blocker. And that might open up enough of an opportunity for him to pop a big run like we saw the long touchdown he had earlier this year. He had 23 receiving yards last week. So if you're telling me I can kind of get that for, I'm assuming he's very much close to min cash.
2,200. Yeah.
Yeah. And then again, Isaiah Likely, I probably lean to slightly over Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews never had over 31 yards in 5 games against the Bills. When Matt Milano's out there, they allow half as many points as when he's not out there. But we see Isaiah Likely line up out wide a little bit more. So, yeah, slight lean to Isaiah Likely at that cheaper price than Mark Andrews. And otherwise, I'm just really hoping that this is going to be a good game and that we're not coming out of it with like ifs and buts and weather issues and crap like that.
I completely agree. On the likely point, I put together a spreadsheet with my projections, my values, and my everything ready for the slate every single week. It's available to all of our members. Isaiah Likely is the best value on the slate based on my projections. I think he doesn't need to have a massive day to hit off at this value. You're talking almost £2,000 cheaper than Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, those kind of guys. It feels like an absolute smash play, and I'd be shocked if he's not in an awful lot of lineups when it comes to that main full weekend slate.
Yeah, it seems to click with him sometimes. Like last week, 3 catches for 53 yards. He had the most receiving yards of any player on the team, and I'd just be very remiss if I didn't put him into a lot of lineups. And I think if you want to attack this one for the ballers lineups, you can definitely look at trying to create a narrative that one team's quarterback, like say Josh Allen scores all the points for the Bills, and then leaning into just the wide receivers, the running backs, guys like Justice Hill on the Ravens, and saying that they have to go pass heavier.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be a fascinating matchup. We talk about Derrick Henry and that weakness of the Buffalo defense. You do wonder if the Bills are just going to say, right, to the Ravens, you're not going to run the ball on us. We're going to stick 8 in the box. And does that then open it up for Bateman or Likely or someone else over the top? So I cannot wait to watch this game. I'm very much excited for the chess match that's going to ensue.
It's just not how the Bills want to play, though, is it? They don't really have the big boys to play that way. So it'd be very interesting to see if they try to do it without that personnel. I have no instinct on how this game's going to play out in terms of the score.
But that's my point. Is I wonder if because they've not got the big boys, maybe they just try and attack it with numbers and say we're going to stick extra bodies in the box. But who knows? I think it's fascinating. I'm very excited. Hopefully, this preview has got you excited to enter some lineups. Go ahead over to the Gameday app. Use that code TFS23 for that second free entry. And as we said, you got the lower priced main slate, you got the higher priced main slate, and of course you got the ballers options. And if you want my projections, jump across to the main Fantasy Sanctuary page, hit the join button, and you can become a member for as little as £1 a month. We'll be back next week. Hope you enjoy the football, and hopefully we bring home some cash.
Nice.